The wreck lay in a field near St. Lo, the grass around it still scorched black from the battle above Normandy. The villagers said the plane had refused to die. Witnesses had seen it limping westward, smoke trailing from the engine, half its tail missing, and yet somehow the pilot had made it out alive. Days later, a convoy of German soldiers arrived to collect the remains. Among them was Captain Dieter Hahn, a Luftwaffe veteran who had flown since the early years of the war. He had seen hurricanes fall like autumn leaves and Spitfires break apart in midair, but never this. He stepped closer, running a gloved hand along the ruptured armor of the Thunderbolt. The shell holes were deep, yet none had pierced the cockpit. The fuselage was warped but unbroken. The thick steel plates around the pilot's seat looked like something torn from a tank rather than an airplane. The smell of burnt oil and cordite hung heavy in the air. Impossible. Someone muttered. Hahn said nothing. That night, as the wreck was hauled to a nearby Luftwaffe depot, rumors spread through the mess hall. Some said the Americans had coated their planes with experimental alloys. Others whispered about self-sealing fuel tanks that refused to ignite. The mechanics joked nervously, calling it der fliegende Panzer, the flying tank. Hahn only stared into his coffee, silent. He knew engineering when he saw it. And this wasn't luck. In Berlin, the propaganda machine boasted that German design was the pinnacle of precision and efficiency, but standing before the half-burnt remains of a P-47 that had endured what no Messerschmitt could, that belief began to crack. Even the youngest pilots, once so sure of German superiority, exchanged uneasy glances. The contrast was jarring. A nation that had built the Bf-109, the sleek FW-190 symbols of speed and agility, was now confronted with something built not to dazzle, but to survive. A plane that looked heavy, even clumsy, yet refused to die. Captain Hahn recorded in his field journal that evening, "We fired hundreds of rounds, but it flew on. It did not fight like a machine. It endured like a creature that wanted to live." Somewhere in the distance. Artillery thundered as the Allies advanced inland. The soldiers at Chartres were still dissecting the wreck, but Hahn already sensed what it meant. This wasn't just an airplane, it was an omen. And as he closed his notebook, he whispered to himself, "If this is what they build in numbers, how do we win?" The hangar at Chartres was sealed under heavy guard. Only engineers and selected Luftwaffe officers were allowed to enter. Floodlights cast pale circles over the broken body of the Thunderbolt, its skin torn, but its shape still proud, resting like a wounded animal that refused to kneel. The men moved quietly, as if in a church. Tools clanked, boots scraped, but no one dared to speak above a whisper. Major Hans Kessler, chief test engineer, stood at the nose of the aircraft, eyes tracing the curve of the fuselage. He had seen countless Allied wrecked Spitfires, Mustangs, Lightnings, but this one unnerved him. It shouldn't have made it back. He murmured to his assistant. The assistant nodded but said nothing. They both knew it had. The outer skin was scorched, riddled with cannon holes, yet the internal frame held together. The cockpit glass was cracked but not shattered, the armored seat intact, even the radio set still functional. One mechanic tried prying open a panel near the fuel tank and stopped mid-motion, frowning. "Sir, the metal bends, but it doesn't tear." Kessler took the piece in his hand. It was heavy, denser than standard aluminum alloys, some kind of hybrid composite. He said softly, "Flexible under heat." "Who makes this?" Across the room, pilots' men used to speed and precision stared in silence. To them, the plane seemed almost alive. The way the armor curved around the cockpit looked deliberate, protective, human. They joked uneasily that perhaps the Americans prayed over their aircraft before flight, but their laughter was hollow. Night fell, and the men worked under dim lamps. The hangar smelled of oil, sweat, and burnt steel. Outside, the wind howled across the empty runway. Inside, they peeled back each layer, expecting weakness, finding only resilience. Oberleutnant Kruger, a veteran pilot, leaned against a crate and said quietly, "It's strange, isn't it? Our planes die beautifully fast, elegant, precise. Theirs refused to die at all." No one answered. The silence grew heavier than the metal before them. In the far corner, a young draftsman sketched the curve of the damaged wing. His pencil trembled as he wrote a note, not armor, a spirit. When the inspection ended, Kessler turned off the lamps and stood for a long moment beside the machine. He reached out and tapped the battered fuselage, whispering, "You shouldn't still be here." But it was torn, burned, bent, and unyielding. Outside, a thunderstorm rolled across the French countryside. The flashes of lightning illuminated the hangar windows, and for a second, the metal beast gleamed as if alive, pulsing with some defiant heart. The men left, one by one, boots echoing down the corridor. None spoke on the drive back to their quarters. Each carried the same thought that perhaps this plane was not built merely of steel, but of will. The next morning, the hangar filled again with the muted sound of wrenches and rivet drills. The air smelled of graphite and oil. On a steel table lay fragments of the Thunderbolt's armor, cut open with precision saws, revealing layers of design that confounded even the most seasoned engineers. Chief metallurgist Ernst Wöhler adjusted his spectacles and ran his fingers across the cross-section of the plating. "Look here," he said, tracing a pattern of rivet holes. "This is no uniform armor. It thickens near the cockpit, then thins deliberately toward the tail." The assistant frowned. "That's wasteful." "No," Wöhler replied quietly. "That's intelligent." They placed the piece under a magnifying lens, and what emerged was a network of overlapping plates designed to deflect, not resist. Each curve redirected impact away from the pilot's seat. Even the fuel lines were shielded behind reinforced bulkheads. The geometry was asymmetrical, but functional, each choice driven by data, not aesthetics. One engineer pointed to the sketch of a Luftwaffe Bf-109 beside it. "We design for balance. They design for survival." Wöhler nodded. "Yes, we fly to win. They fly to return." The team examined bullet trajectories marked on the metal by red chalk. They noticed how the American designers had predicted real combat patterns, the most vulnerable spots protected by thickness unseen in any German plane. It was a map of experience, drawn from thousands of battles, not theories. Rumors spread that the design came from a man named Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian-born engineer working in the United States. Some whispered he had fled Europe long before the war, escaping the old empires to design machines of freedom. A foreigner builds America's strongest plane. Someone muttered, half in disbelief. Perhaps that is their secret. They use the minds we chased away. In the afternoon, the inspection shifted to the cockpit armor. A mechanic tapped the plating near the seat and said with awe, "It's not welded. It's integrated, grown into the frame like a shell." At that, Kessler fell silent. He realized the meaning. This wasn't armor added later. It was born with the aircraft. Planned from the first line of blueprint, Germany's finest engineers were fighting on paper, while America's fought with factories and foresight. A faint wind entered through the hangar doors, rustling blueprints pinned to the walls. The drawings of German fighters, sleek, symmetrical, beautiful, fluttered beside sketches of the P-47's ungainly bulk. For a moment, they seemed to argue in silence, art versus pragmatism. That night, in his notebook, Wöhler wrote, "We build like sculptors. They build like survivors. And perhaps that is why they endure." As the lamps dimmed and the hangar grew quiet, the last thing visible was the pattern of rivets glinting under the light, a strange geometry of salvation. Where every line and angle spoke one truth: this plane was designed not for glory, but for life. By mid-May 1944, the reports from Chartres had reached Berlin. The Reich Air Ministry demanded to know how such a cumbersome machine could defy destruction. What they received instead of answers was an even greater mystery: the origin of its armor. The intelligence section traced the source of the Thunderbolt's plating and uncovered a truth that astonished even hardened officers. The metal did not come from a single plant or foundry. It came from dozens, scattered across a continent: Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Chicago, Detroit, Buffalo. Each mill contributed sheets of steel and aluminum alloy that were shipped by rail, assembled in plants that ran without rest. Major Kessler, summoned to brief the ministry, described it plainly. They do not manufacture airplanes. They manufacture miracles by the millions. In a vast network across the Atlantic, America's production pulse never slowed. Women in overalls operated hydraulic presses that hammered armor plates through the night. Freight trains roared through Kansas and Illinois, loaded with aircraft parts from factories that never slept. Children collected scrap metal, farmers welded in barns, and machinists in Oklahoma produced bolts for planes they would never see. A Luftwaffe intelligence officer read a report aloud. They build a P-47 every 55 minutes. The room went silent. One colonel scoffed. Propaganda. But the data was verified. Kessler spread the photographs on the table, endless rows of half-built fuselages gleaming beneath factory lights. Workers lined shoulder to shoulder. The contrast was staggering. In Germany, skilled craftsmen built fighters by hand, each machine a masterpiece. But slow, fragile, and irreplaceable. In America, production had become a heartbeat. The people, the machines, the trains all synchronized. It wasn't genius. It was momentum. Inside the ministry, some officers whispered bitterly, "They make airplanes like we make bullets." Another replied, "No faster." A young adjutant reported that in one American city, shift workers ate at canteens serving 20,000 meals a day, timed to production shifts, even on Sundays. The factories roared. Germany, still proud of its precision, could not comprehend this rhythm of endless labor. That night, Kessler sat alone in his quarters and looked again at a photograph of an American assembly line. A woman in goggles was riveting armor onto a Thunderbolt's wing, her sleeves rolled up, her face lit by sparks. She looked neither soldier nor worker, she looked determined. He wrote in his diary, "They have replaced factories with faith. Every worker believes their hand turns the tide. We cannot fight that." Outside, in the streets of Berlin, the lights were dimmed for air raids. Inside America's cities, they burned through the night, illuminating machines that never stopped. And as Kessler closed his notebook, he finally understood when an entire nation becomes an assembly line. The war's outcome is decided long before the guns fall silent. Weeks later, on the outskirts of Paris, a Luftwaffe pilot named Otto Reimer sat at a wooden table inside a requisitioned farmhouse. He had just returned from a mission over the Ardennes, his nerves still raw. Opposite him sat an intelligence officer, reading from a typed report about the Thunderbolt's resilience. Otto had no patience for paperwork, yet the words struck him like confession. He remembered a day the previous winter when he had caught one of those heavy American beasts in his sights. He fired an entire burst from his MG-151 cannons. The P-47's right wing burst into flame. The propeller stopped, and he watched it spiral down. He even saw the impact, black smoke curling up from the forest floor. It was, he thought, a clean kill. But 3 days later, while escorting a bomber squadron near Reims, he saw the same markings, the same nose art, a Thunderbolt painted across the fuselage. The pilot waggled his wings before firing a short burst that clipped Otto's canopy. Otto dove away, shaken not by damage, but by disbelief. It cannot be, he had whispered into his oxygen mask. The dead don't come back. Now, months later, reading the intelligence notes, he understood the P-47 was not a fighter, it was a survivor, and the men who flew it carried that same strange confidence. Otto wrote to a comrade that night, "They fight differently. They do not chase death. They expect to return home." Across the room, another pilot laughed bitterly. "We fly to defend the Reich. They fly to go home to their mothers." Otto didn't answer. For the first time, he wondered which was stronger, duty or hope. Word spread through the squadron some P-47's pilots had survived being shot down 3 times. Mechanics whispered about airmen who walked away from crashes that should have been fatal. Every story added to the legend. The plane's reputation grew into something almost supernatural, as if it carried luck within its rivets. During evening briefings, officers noticed the shift in tone. The once confident jokes about slow American machines had vanished. Pilots now spoke of Thunderbolts with wary respect, even fear. A statistic circulated through the Luftwaffe in 1944, the P-47 accounted for nearly 60% of all Allied fighter sorties in Western Europe. The number was staggering, not because of firepower, but because of endurance. Otto's squadron lost 5 men in 1 week. The next day, he saw another Thunderbolt rise from a smoke-filled valley, trailing fire, climbing impossibly high before disappearing into the clouds. He lowered his gaze, unable to watch. That night, he wrote in his logbook, "They build planes that promise return. We build planes that demand sacrifice. I do not know which creed wins wars." He paused, pen hovering over the paper, then added one more line meant for no one but himself. "Maybe belief is the strongest armor of all. Would you have dared to fly against such a machine, knowing it could rise again?" Tell me in the comments below what gives a pilot courage, his nation, his machine, or his faith in survival. In a dim laboratory in Berlin, the smell of burned metal and solvents filled the air. Engineer Friedrich Albrecht adjusted the controls of a furnace glowing bright orange. Inside it lay a melted fragment of P-47 armor brought back from France. The sample hissed, then cooled, leaving behind a metallic sheen unlike anything he had seen in his career. He measured, cut, and tested. The numbers refused to make sense. The alloy was not purely aluminum, not steel, not duralumin. It flexed slightly before fracturing, a delicate balance between strength and elasticity that defied conventional ratios. He ran the tests again. The results were identical. On the chalkboard behind him, formulas covered the wall like battlefield maps. A junior assistant asked, "Herr Albrecht, could it be heat-treated titanium?" Friedrich shook his head. "No, we can't make this. Not yet." Outside the lab, air raid sirens wailed faintly. Inside, he wrote in his logbook, "The Americans have achieved harmony between weight and strength. We make blades, they make shields." Over the next weeks, he and his team tried to replicate the alloy using German methods. Each attempt ended in brittle failures. German steel was strong but rigid. Aluminum was light but fragile. They tried mixing copper, zinc, even traces of magnesium. Yet the results cracked under pressure. He realized what separated them wasn't only chemistry, it was philosophy. German engineering worshipped perfection, pushing for speed, sharpness, lethality. American design embraced endurance. The Thunderbolt's armor wasn't about elegance. It was forgiveness, a machine built to protect life first, victory second. A rumor reached the lab that the Americans used stressed skin construction, where the entire body bore the load, not just the frame. That idea shocked the German engineers. It was designed through empathy, predicting the moment a man would be hit, then building around that human fragility. One evening, exhausted, Friedrich slumped beside the glowing furnace. His hands trembled as he stared at the failed metal samples. He thought of the men at the front, of his younger brother flying a Bf-109 somewhere over Belgium. He whispered to himself, "If only our machines could forgive one mistake." The next morning, the ministry demanded a final report. Friedrich delivered it with a single sentence: "They have learned to value the pilot more than the plane." That line circulated quietly among the engineering corps. Some dismissed it as defeatism, others understood it as truth. By autumn 1944, the American factories were producing over 15,000 Thunderbolts, each one carrying that philosophy in its metal, a design that chose life over perfection. Friedrich's final note, found after the war, read simply, "They built machines to endure, we built machines to dominate." And perhaps that is why they lasted longer than we did. So, what do you think defines true strength, the will to conquer, or the wisdom to preserve? Tell me in the comments. I want to know what you believe. The war was nearing its end. The rail lines that once carried ammunition now carried silence and wounded men. In early 1945, Captain Dieter Hahn, the same man who had first examined that burned Thunderbolt wreck near St. Lo, sat aboard a slow military train heading east. His uniform faded, his belief in victory long gone. Snow fell across the German countryside, blanketing bombed villages and silent fields where once the youth of the Reich had trained to fly. In his hands rested a leather folder. Inside were pages of technical reports, sketches, and photographs of the P-47 Thunderbolt, the so-called Jug. But between the data lay something else, a quiet understanding that could no longer be ignored. Hahn opened his notebook one last time and began to write. "The P-47 is not a marvel of power," he wrote, "but a mirror. In it, we see a nation that protects before it attacks, that values the life of a single pilot more than the prestige of speed." He paused as the train rattled past a bombed bridge in the distance. A group of children waved at the soldiers through the snow. One boy wore a cap too large for his head, the kind fighter pilots once wore with pride. Hahn looked away. The sound of the wheels on the rails reminded him of the endless hum of American factories, steady, unstoppable. Across the aisle, a young lieutenant leafed through an Allied leaflet dropped from the skies. It showed American workers, men and women, smiling beside new Thunderbolts rolling from the line. The slogan beneath read, "Built to bring them home." The lieutenant scoffed. Hahn did not. He whispered, That is exactly why we lost. The engineer Kessler, who once marveled at the aircraft's design, now served as a POW interpreter in Bavaria. One evening, while guarding a hangar where captured Thunderbolts were stored, he brushed his hand against the cold metal fuselage. "It's strange," he told another guard. "It doesn't look like victory or defeat. It looks like protection." The other man nodded but said nothing. Months later, Hahn's report reached a senior officer in Berlin. It was brief and final. The P-47 is proof that the Americans understood war differently. To them, technology is not for domination, it is for preservation. That difference is decisive. When Germany finally surrendered, the Thunderbolts roared above the ruins not in triumph, but in endurance. Their engines thundered across the same skies where the war had begun. Carrying the same message, survival is the greatest victory. Years later, Hahn visited a museum in Munich. A restored P-47 stood beneath soft lights, its polished armor gleaming. He approached slowly, his reflection shimmering on the curved metal. He laid his hand against the fuselage and whispered, "You were never my enemy. You were our lesson." For a moment, the hum of distant engines seemed to echo through the hall. He closed his eyes. The war was long over. But the question remained, what if we had built to protect instead of to destroy? The war ended, but its echoes never truly faded. In the years that followed, engineers, pilots, and soldiers on both sides would look back at the P-47 Thunderbolt and see not just a machine of war, but a symbol of what humanity could build when survival mattered more than conquest. It was a paradox of metal and mercy, born in an age of destruction, yet built around the fragile heart of the man inside it. For the German officers who had once believed in the perfection of their own designs, the Thunderbolt had shattered an illusion. It proved that strength was not found in precision alone, nor in arrogance or ideology, but in compassion woven into engineering. The armor that wrapped around its pilot like a guardian angel spoke louder than any speech or victory march. In the post-war years, fragments of P-47 wreckage were displayed in small museums across Europe. Children touched the rivets, veterans stood silently before them. Some whispered prayers, others simply stared, remembering the sound of that roaring engine that had refused to die. And somewhere in America, in a quiet factory town, a retired riveter would tell her grandchildren, "We built those planes so our boys would come home." The lesson endures. The Thunderbolt was not elegant, not graceful, but it was human. It carried within its steel the same contradiction that defines us all: the instinct to fight and the yearning to live. Even decades later, when the world had changed and new wars had come and gone, old men still dreamed of the sound of rivet guns, the glow of furnaces, and the smell of oil on the assembly lines that once beat like the pulse of a nation. And perhaps, in those dreams, they understood what the German engineers had finally realized in that silent hangar at Chartres, that the greatest machines are not built merely to win wars, but to preserve the lives that fight them.